Hello and welcome to this Our Broken Planet event from the Natural History Museum in London. Today we are talking women and climate change. Now, women are in many ways in the front lines of climate change. They are disproportionately affected by the effects of this planetary emergency, and in particular in the global south, with these effects have an important impact. But women and girls are also leading the battle against the planetary emergency. They're doing this as activists, community leaders, heads of grassroots organizations, and so on. However, women are still underrepresented in climate change negotiation and decision-making panels. At COP26, for example, which happened really recently, women made only 33% of the representatives in decision-making tables. And as of the end of last year, only 24 countries out of the 195 countries in the world are led by women. Now, to explore this with me today, we are joined by three exceptional women leading the way. So I'd like you to welcome them to this chat. Let's give a warm welcome to Lydia Wanjiku Kibandi. Lydia is the Chief Executive Officer at Lensational, a non-profit social enterprise that aims to elevate the voices of underrepresented women through photography. Lydia's passion for elevating women's voices, is evident not only through her academic work in photojournalism, but also seen through her intimate involvement with the women she works with and the strategic direction steering forward Lensational. Lydia has also earned recognition as a young leader in her country through a nomination in Kenya's Business Daily Top 40 and the 40 Women in Leadership in 2019. So thank you so much, Lydia, for joining us today. Hello.
Hello.
So, to join Lydia as well, we also have Nicki Becker with us. Now, Nicki is a climate justice activist based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and she's the co-founder of Jovenes Por El Clima, Youth for the Climate, a movement that educates about climate change from a Latin American perspective and a human rights perspective. She's also the lead convenor of Fridays for Future, FFF, in Argentina as well. And for all these efforts fighting against climate change, the Argentine Congress has recognized Nicki as one of the most outstanding young women in the country. Welcome so much, Nicki.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here as well. And joining Lydia and Nicki, we have our own Natural History Museum professor, Anjali Goswami. Now, Anjali is an internationally renowned comparative biologist and the Dean of Postgraduate Education and Research Leader in Life Sciences at our museum, the Natural History Museum in London. In addition to her outstanding academic record and profile as a spokesperson for the science of natural history, she has a wealth of experience and passion for promoting diversity and inclusion in STEM subjects. In addition to her roles at the museum, she's also a honorary professor in paleontology in the Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment at University College London, and trustee and president-elect of the Linnean Society of London. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Anjali.
Hi, thank you.
Hello, I'm really excited to start talking women and climate change with you three. Now, we know that women are leading the way against climate change and fighting to mitigate the effects. Now, you are three amazing examples of this, and I can't wait to start talking about this. Now, women are leading this through NGOs, social movements, grassroots organizations, communities. But I'd like to explore this with you three as well. So why is this? Why are women in these roles? And before we start talking, I would like to point out that there is this stereotype that says that, women are more caring and therefore we care more about our planet and we are more prone to these kind of roles. But as I said before, this is, just a stereotype. So let's talk the reality. So what is happening to women that are being pushed into these leadership roles fighting climate change. So let's start chatting a little bit with Lydia, for example. Now, Lydia, you, as we said before, you're one of the women leading the change, but you are also meeting and mentoring women leading the change through Lensational. So, in your experience and in the experience of the women that you are meeting, what drives women to push for this change?
Okay, thank you so much, Christina. It's so lovely to be here. I believe, and based on my experience, I would attribute the reason or the drive for change amongst women to two main factors. And the first one is survival. And I've seen these amongst the photographers that we work with at Lensational. They are women who feel the impacts of climate change every day in their daily lives in a very tangible way. Well, I am in a more, I live in a more urban setting, and I'm not necessarily in a situation where the impacts of climate change show my day. The women that I work with, this is the case for them. And what has been interesting to learn is that although this is the reality, they are not necessarily building or practicing resilience on the basis of advocating for change. They're not coming up with the visions or the practices of the resilience, thinking, how could I influence national adaptation plans or so on? They are building resilience to ensure that their families, their children, their livelihoods, and they themselves can survive the very adverse effects of climate change. So and in a sense, they are doing change as opposed to pushing for change, which I believe is like two different things. It's because they have to change that they are doing something about it. And because the reality of the planet as it is right now directly impacts them. And that is what propels them to act, not having any other choice. We then at Lensational make them people who push for change by using their stories and their images for activism. So I believe that is one of the main factors that contributes to women, pushing for change. And if, for example, there's one image I've shared with you where there is a group of women who are seated in around like a round table. And in this image, it's a group of Maasai women. Yes, that image that are seated. And what's happening there is that due to the drought that is being experienced in this part of the country, which is Esiteti in Amboseli, Kenya, livestock, which is the mainstay for Maasai community that dwells in that area, has been greatly reduced, mostly due to migration to the areas that have better pastures. And as a result, affecting the availability of milk, which is a staple in their homes. And what the women are now doing is that they are building a kitty where they contribute the equivalent of 65 cent pounds. And that amount they raise is used to purchase a variety of food items that is shared amongst the different homesteads. And what they say is that as long as one home has some food, the rest can also get some food. Another great example of some of the immediate kind of adaptive measures or change that the women are having so that they can survive is an image that I've shared where there is a woman with a pile of sacks that she's filling in some sand with. And this is a practice, yes, that amazing photo. And this is a practice where women in this region, which is very close to the border of Tanzania, to the border of Kenya and Tanzania, they collect sand, like salty sand, and they take it to those parts of Tanzania which are a bit more green and where people practice farming in exchange for food. So for food items, so whether it could be maize, it could be potatoes, it could be beans, and this is what they then come back with to feed their families. The second factor that I believe drives women to change is empathy. And I can speak about this. It's almost synonymous to what you said, but I think it's a bit different in that I had an encounter with one of our photographers. Amongst one of the pictures that I have shared there is a portrait of a young lady that's holding a camera. Her name is Claire. And she's one of the photographers that we are training in the same region, which is Asiteti, Amboseli, Kenya. Yes, and there is a selfie of Claire and myself. And Claire is one of the photographers who is taking part in photography training for climate action, a program that we have partnered with National Adaptation Plan Global Network to bring underrepresented voices, underrepresented women's voices to the forefront of climate change adaptation and planning through the stories that we share. And during one of the workshops that we were having with Claire, and she was describing to me her photo project, and she highlighted going for days, including the very day that we were working together, without a decent meal. And I was taking notes, and I remember I wrote down that and I said, hold on, did you just say this is happening to you? And she said, yes, it's happening to me. It's happening to another photographer. And I said, what do you mean? Like, I was in complete disbelief. And that experience has changed me since then. And it has changed the drive that I have towards ensuring that more voices for underrepresented women are heard, and ensuring that there are actually sustainable solutions that are being driven back down by policymakers for them. And so those are the two main factors that I would attribute to driving women to change, in my experience.
I think you put it with your stories, with your examples, Lydia. You put it really clear there. That it's not that. First of all, it's women driven by pushed by climate change that are pushed to these leadership roles and these decision making roles. And I think you said it there. Empathy is just acknowledging everyone's experiences and how climate change is affecting yourself, but also the people around them, that is making them react in this way, taking these leadership roles. So those are stories really, really good examples of what's happening and how it's not, we can't just think about stereotypes to explain women taking on these roles and going ahead and driving for change. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Nicki, what do you think yourself? So what's your experience, and you as a person who started a movement and is leading this movement, how do you feel about this, about women leading movements and leading change?
Thank you for having me about this question. I'm thinking about what Lydia said, because for a lot of people in the global south, it's not a choice, for example, being a climate activist. It's something that we need to do to guarantee us a present and a future. And it's funny, but not funny, but it's important, because part of the reason I decided to start dedicating my life to being a climate activist is because I'm a woman. Everything started when a friend had created a WhatsApp group with young people here in Argentina in February of 2019, 3 years ago, to organize the first international climate shake. And that the same day, I had seen a video of Greta Thunberg that caught my attention, because I didn't understand why nobody in my country was talking about the climate crisis. Nobody. 3 years ago, nobody knows about the climate crisis here, or just a few people. I didn't hear about this in school, in media, or everywhere. So I started to investigate, and I couldn't believe everything I was reading and how I didn't know it before. And there I was sure that, okay, I need to do something. So I joined this WhatsApp group to create a Youth for Climate Argentina in my country. And I say to myself, it's just to give a hand, but I don't have time. But I saw that there was no women leading this movement. So when I want to realize, I was dedicating my life to it. So And it's of course it's also because I was very worried, but this factor has influence, and I also to realize that a lot of time when we think about the climate crisis, we associate with a polar bear. If you, for example, look in Google climate crisis, the first picture is a polar bear. And I think our biggest challenge as a movement, as a climate activist, is trying to break this picture that that the people still have, and try to explain what Lydia is saying, that the climate crisis, when we talk about the climate crisis, we are talking about evaluation, about our evaluation of our basic human rights. And the people that is suffering the most is the people less responsible of this crisis. And if we understand this, and as you said before, the women has an important role, because we are not just passive victims of this crisis, but we are also leading the change. So I think it's part of our identity, and a lot of people, a lot of women that are part of the youth movement too. Being a woman, in a way, is part of why we choose to be a climate activist.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicki. I think you've given really good pointers in what you were saying there. And it's really, really interesting as well, seeing it in a perspective. As you were saying at the beginning, it's like, you know, our awareness with climate change, and how, you know, in the last 3 years that has changed massively. And it's thanks to, you know, you've mentioned Greta Thunberg, but people like yourselves as well are leading the way and making people aware of what's going on. And again, talking about that empathy that Lydia was talking about, and changing the focus to from the polar bear to actually people being affected by it. Anjali, coming to you. Now, I have to say, you are a driving force for change at the museum yourself. So I'd like to hear your point of view on this. What do you think, especially coming from an environment where, you know, you are seeing the data there, you are seeing paper after paper coming out, and seeing the effects of climate change, what's going on with climate change, and how do you drive that change in the museum, in an academic environment, but also as yourself?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say it's really inspirational being here with Lydia and Nicki, who are coming at this from a very different kind of system and very different perspective from what I'm coming from. So I'm basically working in a fairly structured environment in terms of academia. It's been going on for 1,000 years. It probably hasn't changed that much in 1,000 years in many ways. It's this very, very hierarchical, very patriarchal kind of a structure that I work in, and that we've been kind of that I've developed my career in. And so thinking about about how academia interacts with the planetary emergency as a scientist, and also as somebody working in this kind of structure, but also as a woman in this field, I think it's there's a lot of different things going on. First of all, as somebody who is an environmental scientist, I work on the evolution of animals over deep time. I look at how climate has impacted the evolution of different groups, how mass extinction has affected how the world looks today, how events that happened hundreds of millions of years ago are still where we still feel their effects on the earth today. And so that gives you a huge amount of perspective from what we're doing right now. I think most academics who work in this field, as I do, are terrified, quite frankly, about what is coming. Just to put this in a little bit of perspective, right? The last time we saw this kind of temperature change, the closest that we can get to in terms of the scale of temperature change happened about 55 million years ago, and it completely transformed life on Earth. And so it's not something that we take lightly. And in fact, it's something that we've been talking about. Certainly, I've been in academia for about 25 years now. And I know that when I started out, people then were telling me, we've got 5-10 years to turn this around. Things are going to start getting pretty crazy in about 15 to 20 years. So we've known this for a long time, right? And yet nothing's really happened. And so it's been incredibly frustrating as somebody who sees the data and then sees the lack of response to it until we've gotten to the point where it almost feels like, I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but we waited until the very last second before we actually did anything. And I think that is because we've been largely working within these entrenched structures, these structures that are overwhelmingly run by men, that are overwhelmingly run by not just men, but old boy networks, right? Where everybody is buddy-buddy. They make decisions in smoky rooms. They don't really make decisions that are necessarily for the best for everyone, but they're certainly the best for themselves, right? And so all of these kind of different organizations, and including academia, are really run by a very small group of people. And so it's really inspirational to me to see what Lydia and Nicki and so many other people around the world are doing, which is create an alternative system for making change. Because the incremental change that we see in systems like, government and like academia are not going to be fast enough, right? We see slow improvements in terms of representation, as you mentioned, in terms of government representation and academic representation. Throughout my entire career, we see, about 50% of undergraduate students studying biology or environmental sciences are women. In graduate school, 50% are women. And then you get into lecturer scale, you get to assistant to professorial scale, you get to heads of department, and it drops off to 20% and even less, 20% just in permanent jobs, even less in leadership positions. And that drop off has not gotten much better over the entire time that I've been in academia. So that kind of change, although I keep pushing for it, I do it at the museum, I've done it at universities, as do many others, but the rate of change is not going to be fast enough to see the change that we need to happen in the world, which is why I think people working outside of that existing system is really going to be much, much more impactful at pushing the change at the rate that we need it to happen at.
That's really key what you're saying there, Anjali. We're going to talk a little bit about numbers. We're going to crunch some numbers in a minute, but I just want to point out, I think what you said there is just something that we've been knowing for years now, and it seems that it has taken it to hit people for people starting to having to say, okay, well, you that have been knowing this for a long time haven't done anything. We have to do it ourselves, and that's why I think that's why it's women, it's people affected by climate change that are actually leading that change, because those archaic systems that you're saying are doing nothing. So let's have a look at those systems, and let's have a look at some numbers. But first, I wanted to just say thank you to everyone that is watching at the moment and sending comments. If you have any questions for our panelists today, our guests today, please put them on the chat. We have a question from Stevie. They're asking, well, first of all, they want to say thank you for the conversation, and they want to know what's the best way that we can drive change. We're going to talk a bit about that towards the end of the conversation. So Stevie, I'm going to ask you to stay with us, but if anyone else has any other questions as well that they'd like to ask our guests, please put them on the chat and we'll try to get through as many as possible. But let's have a look at these numbers. So we were talking before about COP26. COP26 happened in September. As I said before, 33% of women in negotiation table, even though there were loads of women involved in COP26, which is, very, very frustrating in some way. So when you hear about this disparity between men and women representatives in this conference in general, how do you feel about this? It is not only the conference. You can see a picture here when even the picture is quite small. It's taken from The Guardian, but you basically only see black and dark suits. There's barely, I think there's a couple of women in that picture. So yeah, really, really frustrating thing. It happens as well in government. And as we said before, 24 of the 195 countries are led by women. That's not even a quarter. It's way less than that. And then also it's interesting to have a look at how the portfolios that women have in power as well. It's only 40 countries that have 14 countries out of those 195 that have achieved 50% or more women in cabinets. That's not, leading the countries, but it's also 50%. So I want to ask you three, How do you feel when you see these numbers? Let's start this time with Nicki. How do you feel about this?
Angry. No, but it's curious because in Youth for Climate Argentina, the international youth movement of Friday for Future is led by women all over the world, in the Philippines, in Germany, in Colombia. Everywhere you look, there is at least one woman leading. And I think it has to do with something also generational. My first march, for example, was on an International Women's Day when I was 14 years old, and I had to ask my mom to come with me because I was very little. And it's example of many women who today lead the climate movement, but our activism come from feminism, and our way of seeing the world is also born from there. So I think it's also, or this also shows a problem that our generation is not in the decision making, because at some point this problem of representation of women will also change if we will be there, because I think it's quite different in my generation. It's not enough, and we also need to change a lot of things. But at least if you see and if you analyze the youth movement, not only the climate movement, but in general, women are leading. So I think if more young people and more women are in the decision making, this definitely will change.
You've made you've made a really really important point there, Nick, is how feminism is actually empowering us to actually push and be there and try to lead those movements. But yeah, that was really really inspiring what you said there. Lydia, what do you think? How do you feel about these numbers, incredible numbers, and yeah, why do you think this is happening?
I think first to answer your question about how I feel, it's quite sad and unfortunate, and sometimes it almost feels helpless. I really resonated a lot with what Anjali was talking about how there's such a patriarchal society in many of these systems, and I hope that we can have more conversations about how women representation can go higher. And I remember having a call with a few other people, and we're talking about, what goes into what's considered, especially like in the COP20s, in the COP meetings, like how do they decide who's attending the meetings? Input for women representation needs to begin from the planning phase, not just the invites or that. And I think that there needs to be more I guess there needs to just be more room for women to participate in the very key decisions, not just in the final output, like, hey, COP is happening on this month, all these people are invited, but really just from the foundation, from like the root of planning and involving women in that. And hopefully we can start seeing more women participating in key decisions.
Absolutely.
I hope that answers your question, Christina.
Yeah, absolutely, Lydia, absolutely. Anjali, I'm gonna go to you as well with a question. I think you've already touched on it, and you said before we are in systems that are patriarchal, and they're embedded. That patriarchy is embedded in them. So yeah, I suppose that you will share frustration and disappointment with the other guests when you think about these numbers, but yeah, why can you expand a little bit more about what you said, and why do you think this representation is so low? How do you feel about this?
Sure. I mean, I think it stems from something that's actually been scientifically quantified, which is that women and also people of color get far less credit for the work that they do and their novel ideas and their innovations compared to white men, quite frankly. And so when people think about leaders, and when they think about who they want to go to these sorts of events and be representing large groups, they automatically overemphasize the contributions of one demographic and underemphasize or entirely ignore the contributions of another one, which is almost overwhelmingly women, get overlooked. And so and this has always been going on. And so, in all of my time in academia, for example, I've never had a female boss, which is pretty shocking because I've had a lot of bosses. And so that's one of those things where that there are lots of great women who are doing exceptional work, who are really, in many ways, the best people for these roles, for these representative positions, especially in the climate and environmental space. But we don't see them getting the credit for that. And so I think there's a lot of things that need to happen. I think it's a little easier maybe for us to also talk about making these big changes because we don't owe a lot to the current system. In fact, we owe nothing, I think, to the current system. And so we're not beholden to it. I'm not concerned about completely changing everything because what we've been doing so far does not work, right? It doesn't work for us and it doesn't work for everyone if it doesn't work for us, quite frankly. So I think what we need to do is not just slowly hope for incremental change and representation. We need to force that change either both through existing systems, but also through these parallel systems that give voice and give attention to people who aren't going to get that attention through the normal systems. And that's what's the most amazing thing about the current state of the international climate justice movement, is that it is, when you think about the people who are making a difference, you are not thinking about the people in that picture. I can't name any of those people, and I don't care about them. But I do care about people like Nicki and Lydia, who are the people that people think of when they think about who's going to save this world, right? And so we need to make sure we keep pushing that, don't let the pressure up. And I think we need to amplify the people who are actually making change as much as possible so that it becomes impossible to ignore them and impossible to overlook their work and their efforts. And that way, the next time these things come around, they won't be able to pretend that they're the people in those pictures are the only ones that matter, because we will know different and people won't just let that slide. So I think we just have to make sure we continuously, as a group, amplify the people who are really making real change and the ones who are really going to make the real changes to the system that allow the important work that needs to be done actually happen.
And Anjali, that was a really, really powerful message that you said there, and very, yeah, it just makes you want to keep fighting and keep doing this, and as you said, just open the way. And I think you're a really good person to say this, because you are doing this. You're doing this at the museum. You've got an amazing project called the Explorer Projects. It's not about women in science. It's about people of color in STEM and in science. And it's actually, it's creating that environment where, making people feel more welcome in a space where traditionally they hadn't feel welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? I really want to bring it up because I think it's really important, and it shows how things can actually happen if people actually put the minds together and create something as good as that.
So this is a program that we just launched as part of the graduate education and postgraduate education at the museum. And basically it's to create networks and create programs to get students and early career researchers from underrepresented minority backgrounds together to give them the network to help them progress in their careers, to give them the guidance, the sorts of things that we don't often find exist for us, because very often we're the only people that look like us in a room. So what we're doing is having a series of events throughout the year to get all of us together, give us that support structure to continue to work in these fields, make sure people recognize that we're not alone. You're not fighting alone. You're not pushing ahead alone. There's something at the end that we're all going to work towards. We're all going to be part of this new, more diverse, more representative, and more inclusive academic culture, and not just academia, but also all of the impact that environmental sciences has on the broader environmental movement. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get kids and students at a young age to see themselves as environmental scientists, or see themselves in the environmental movement, and recognize that it's not just for one demographic, the ones who generally are what you picture as environmental scientists, but it's really for all of us, because you absolutely have to have that diversity and that representation if you are actually going to make real change in this area. Absolutely,
and sadly we don't see that representation in in the environmental, in STEM or in environmental sciences yet. I don't have the numbers of other communities, but I do know that, for example, only 30% of all environmental scientists are women, which was really shocking because, as you said, Anjali, there are loads of women scientists, there are loads of women in environmental sciences, but the pipeline makes them stop in some of the way, and it's not only women, it's other collectives, it's other communities. So it's really, really important to get there. We're getting loads of good questions from our viewers. We have a really good question from Jessica that I'd like to actually ask you three. Actually, Nicki, I'm going to send it to you because you are the leader of a youth movement. You've been on demonstrations. So Jessica was asking, do you think women are excluded from some spaces like protests due to personal safety concerns and the increased trolling, which is targeted at women, which can put them off joining activist movements? So do you think that basically sexism is pulling women aside from this kind of activism? What do you think?
Definitely. I think it depends of the country and the security of the country. But for example, I think that I'm a privileged one, but for example, when I started to be a climate activist, I have been criticized a lot, but not because of my ideas, of not because of what I thought, but because I was very young, because I was a woman, or I received a lot of criticize about my body. And I think it's something that as women, we grow up learning how to deal with that. And at the beginning, it's horrible. And then now if someone tell me something about my body, I don't care, and I don't read, I know, the comments of YouTube of a talk that I did. I mean, it's something that then you get used to, but it's not something fair, and I don't feel that I'm the most effective for that, because I live in a country that we live a dictatorship a lot of time ago. So now it's safe to protest. It's safe because it's something very cultural of Argentina. But I know a lot of climate activists from all over the world. For example, in Colombia, it's very dangerous. In the Philippines too, that doing a protest is something really dangerous, something really, really, really that you're putting your life at risk, and more if you're a woman. So definitely it's related.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I wonder if Anjali and Lydia have anything to add to that. Anjali, what do you think?
Oh, I think absolutely. That is at a very important point. When you were talking about the pipeline earlier, we talk about the pipeline a lot in terms of why women leave science and leave the environmental field. But what is, I think, less talked about, but actually I think probably an even larger problem, is that a lot of these spaces are very hostile for women. Academia can be a very hostile environment to be a woman because of harassment or even just being ignored and excluded. So we can have improvements in representation, but unless you're actually included, representation alone isn't enough. And so I think we fundamentally need to change the working environment and the environment for personal safety before we're going to see the kind of change that we need to see. And of course, we can only the way we need to do that is by forcing it to happen ourselves.
Absolutely. Lydia, what do you think?
I don't want to water down what Nicki and Anjali have already said, but I echo their words. I think it's also a challenge that we experience in photography. The moment that you come up with a camera and you're a young lady, questions come up, sometimes people tend to harass you. I do agree that the best way we can maybe overcome this, certainly overcome this, is by creating better working environments for women such as we are, and ensuring that we force that change, like Anjali said. I really loved that point, honestly. I'm taking that down.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to write down some of the comments that you made here, because you've said really, really, really strong things. But yeah, we need to force that change. We need to create those safer spaces where, women doesn't feel for the safety when they are actually doing something to change the way things are. Now we get into the end of the talk. Sadly, I could be talking with for hours with you three about these. I want to talk about what comes next. So we've already talking about forcing that change. So now that I think this disparity in representation in climate change fighting and climate change decision making is happening. We've acknowledged what's going on. Let's talk a little bit about what comes next. And we had a couple of questions from our viewers that actually were asking about that. So Stevie was asking very early in the show, what's the best way we can drive change in a positive direction? And then we had another question asking what sorts of fundamental system change would most help progress in gender and climate. I think we've touched a little bit on it, but I'm going to focus on different work that you three are doing. So Lydia, going to you first. So you've got Lensational, which is a way of leading this change. So can you tell us a little bit about how these kind of projects can elevating the work on women can help them fight against climate change, but not only that, but also denounce the effects that climate change is having on vulnerable communities. So tell us a little bit more about what kind of change these projects drive.
Okay. So first of all, I believe that we are making women and their stories visible, which, as Anjali well highlighted, that if there are not any of these alternatives kind of avenues for women's voices to be heard, we would barely hear them. And this is how we're elevating their experiences. Of course, we don't do the work they do, we just simply facilitate. And like I mentioned earlier, is that, although the photographers we work with are the ones who feel the impact, it can be argued that their realities are not effectively reflected within the global climate movement. And we see this when we get to speak to them. Their concerns do not revolve around carbon emissions or adaptation plans, nor are they aware of climate activism, which is supposedly representing their struggles, that they are further, aggravated by the climate crisis. And during the summit, in one of the sessions by the National Adaptation Plan, who we are partnering with in elevating most of these women's voices, one of the NAP representatives in one of the countries that we're working in Ghana, his name is Mr. Antwi, said that one of the importance for this program, for such programs, is that it allows governments and people in local communities to speak the same language about climate change. And this is how we have seen projects such as ours elevating women's voices and denouncing the effects of climate change on vulnerable communities. And this is why we do what we do, so that we can advocate for policies that speak the same language that the citizens otherwise the policies will not work. So that, I think, is maybe in a nutshell how projects such as ours is elevating the voices of women.
Absolutely, that is really wonderful, and it's really tangible as well. I think the way that you've put it there, when we think about what comes next, what can we change, sometimes it's really difficult to see things that are practical and tangible, and I think the way you put it, it's just really, really clear. Nicki, from your point of view, what comes next? And are you seeing? I'm actually particularly interested in it as a young person. Are you seeing a change in the trends of how things go in young people?
Yes, for sure, but still not enough. And that's why, for me, fighting for the climate, but not for gender equality or the other way around, makes no sense. They go hand in hand. And youth movement like Youth for Climate Argentina or Friday for Future are very clear about this, because I'm a climate activist, because I believe that the environmental movement has the opportunity to break a new ground. Environmentalism is one of the engines for questioning the status quo and building a better world, because climate justice is about collectively redesign a better world, not only in terms of avoiding this climate collapse, but also in terms of social justice and equality, because we don't want to conserve the world as it is now, but to build and create a fairer one. So I don't have the receipt for what the next steps are, but what I do know is that we still have a lot to do, and that the only way to solve the climate crisis is to have more women and more young people in the decision making.
Brilliant. And until that still starts happening in these systems that Anjali was talking about, let's keep fighting in the activist movements that you happen that you are lead, like the ones that you are leading, Nicki. That's also again a great answer. Anjali, I'm going to go to you last. Again, throughout the whole talk, you've been making really important points. But in your opinion, what comes next? And from your point of view as a scientist as well, how can we change the way things are at the moment?
I think we have to do exactly what Nicki and Lydia were saying. We need to raise awareness. We need to make sure that we are amplifying people's voices. We need to absolutely push the intersectionality of gender equality, race equality, and climate justice. All of these things are part of the same fundamental issue in our society. And I think, obviously over the past 2 years, we have seen how quickly normal can change if you need it to, right? So there's no reason why we can't make these changes happen. And so we just can't take no for an answer. I think, looking at COP and the blah, 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 that was fantastic, right? We have to call out all these excuses for why we can't make these changes and force them to happen. So we have to really push these parallel streams to the main governmental structures and make sure we just don't take no for an answer, that we keep pushing the voices that aren't normally heard but are the ones that are actually saying the right things. And we have to just make sure we don't give up.
Christina, may I add a point real quick?
Go for it.
I meant to say this earlier when Anjali was speaking, and just to echo the same thing that Nicki and Anjali have been talking about, I believe that one other thing that might be helpful to do is for women who are already at the table, to create room for more women, just like, with the program, The Explorer, that you mentioned, Anjali, that is exactly what you're doing. And I believe that for those who are at the top and who are women and have had that privilege, to continue creating more spaces and room for other women to come in. I believe that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. We need to demand that the women that are in those leadership positions and are not doing something, because some of them are, that they actually make the space for all the women to go there. And sorry, Anjali, but I'm going to take it. Don't take no as an answer. That is a really, really important point of the talk as well. And with that, we've reached the end of the show. It's been fantastic to have you three in this talk. It's been fantastic to share this talk with you and chatting with you about all this. I could stay another 45 minutes, another hour, another day chatting to you. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future. But from now, I'm going to say thank you so much, Lydia, Anjali, and Nicki, for joining us today. It's been fantastic to have you. And I'm going to say goodbye to you and hopefully see you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you as well, everyone, for watching, for being there and sending your comments and questions. So if you have enjoyed the show, please consider making a donation to support the work at the Natural History Museum. And do stay tuned to Our Broken Planet through our website, our social media channels, and the display that is at the Natural History Museum in London, which you can visit for free. And the museum is open, so just pop and visit us. Remember that the display is over there. And that was all from me. I was Cristina Sorrente. See you next time. Bye-bye.